Effectivement, ce qui nous intéresse ici à Paris-Saclay Springs, c'est d'étudier, d'explorer les frontières de la science, de la médecine, jusqu'à l'espace. Et nous allons effectivement nous intéresser à cette deuxième révolution spatiale avec une question: comment le NewSpace peut créer de la valeur qui soit à la fois économique et durable? Et puis surtout, peut-être la première question, c'est quoi au fond
So what are we doing in NewSpace?
Souveraineté et durabilité, comment l'espace peut permettre de mieux
How can space help us better understand
comment les nanosatellites avec leur moteur miniature prennent en compte le durable?
what's going on with the sustainable environment? This is what we're going to be looking at with Mr. Richard and Mr. Meftah, Traineau, and
Bonjour,
a colleague.
installez-vous, je vous en prie. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je vous en prie, prenez place.
So, take your seat.
Merci beaucoup d'être
Thanks very much for being with us. You'll help us understand this particular field, which is very much in one's imagination, but entirely new. In other words, conquest of space. Let me start with you. You're an engineer in the CNRS laboratory, specialized in space at LATMOS. So we're going to be talking about new tech, but I think we need to understand what new space involves and why is it so new. Well, new space is a definition which is a bit singular, I suppose, because there's not one new space, there's several. And it's an industry that was born in the US around the year 2000, and it was helped by a specific legal environment to facilitate sales in that field. So when you have lots of failures with the Challenger and the Columbia, for example, the Americans put through a law to enable the advent of private entities to put into orbit systems on their own launchers. And then there was a Space Act that went through in 2015, which took things off to access to space very much by these private players. So originally we had state players, that's old space. New space involves room or scope for private companies, but with significant public monies. And then the third phase, it'll be one where we're just seeing private capital. And that will be, as I said, the third revolution in space. So it's the end, really, of the state totally pegging out space, because now private players can enter into the frame. Now, we hear a lot about, pie-in-the-sky projects, people who want to get metal, precious metals on asteroids and mine them there. But for you, what's most important is climate change. Is that right? Yes. Obviously, there's a sales dimension to this, in Internet of Things and access to Internet. But as a scientist, as a researcher, one of the priorities and one of the things that really is at stake for the 21st century, from a societal perspective, is global warming. So I think we really need to have satellites to that end. Need to have a constellation of satellites. That's the watchword. And this will help us address major issues. We want to have a better way of observing what's going on from space. Spatial temporal analysis is very important for the climate temperatures we wish to gauge, and then there are 50 or so essential climate variables that can be observable only from space. So space is strategic and crucial for Earth observation and studying the climate. You said there's a number of newcomers that can enter into this arena, which obviously prompts a regulatory environment as well. I mean, it shouldn't be Far West, can it? Well, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. We're in a Far West environment as we speak. We're the Three Musketeers in space, if you will. We've got Elon Musk, we've got Richard Branson, and Jeff Bezos, the Three Musketeers. Now, we could also call them the orphans of the Apollo mission. They were disappointed for new landing on the moon, so they're offering other ways to go. And then, of course, sitting behind that are vast economic and financial interests. If you're going to be interested in using space-based resources, then obviously you want to set up launchers, you want to have mega constellations of satellites. When you're talking about constellations with 30,000 satellites for one carrier, or possibly more, and you want to increase the number of satellites in space, obviously you're going to grapple with an overpopulation of satellites revolving around the planet. So we're going to have to converge to some sort of regulatory environment, international laws that have to be abided by. Now, in 1967, that law said that space belongs to mankind. It's a common good. And so, there is a sort of prohibition of, a state cannot appropriate a portion of space. And another parameter is astronomy. Now, these vast constellations will have an impact on telescopes on the Earth. We're going to have light contamination, so we'll have to manage space junk, but also it will be difficult to follow astral bodies from the Earth's surface. So you're talking about the Three Musketeers. These are individuals who've got vast individual fortunes. So in that particular environment, CNRS, the French Public Research Institute, what can it do? Well, I'm talking about my own personal activities in my lab. Of course, our primary vocation is to do research. And one of the topics that we address is climate study. And we use instruments, we use satellites. They're instruments for us as well, help us to observe these variables. And then based on observations, we'll be able to build models. So what's the point of having a model? Well, you want to see something, and then you want to predict something, and then you could also see what happened in the past. So why are we using all these tools? Well, I think there's two things at stake here. First, we want to build technological solutions and have them approved on the back of small satellites. That way we can make mini leaps to build concepts, to upscale and outperform. Second, satellite constellations. So quite clearly, lots of operators are interested in latency. You want to be able to retrieve information from space quickly. And if you have a network of observation, you can map flows and have real-time information about what's going on the Earth's surface. Now, a little hiccup, though, is when you've got a small satellite, you can have a small opening, a small diameter, and that will give you a limit to the amount of resolution quality. So we need these big satellites, and we're going to use them in conjunction, therefore, with small satellites in these constellations. And, of course, that's something we need to have. You've talked about, overpopulation. It's almost a paradox. Overpopulation in our immediate orbit of these various machines, because old space and new space have to live together. So Jean-Claude Traineau, you are a space director at Onera. Now, when you say new space, you might say, right, this is another frontier. But as it's just been said, that frontier is populated, which generates pollution as well. So these two concepts are not to be pitted against each other, are they? Well, no, I suppose it would be a surprise to you to learn that old and new space, they don't really exist. It is space, full stop. And it's just the changing face of space, which is what you'd expect. We're moving away from state-operated space, and as what was said a moment ago, for the last 20 years in the US, 10 years, let's say, in Europe, we've seen emerge newcomers, private newcomers to space. Why? Well, because you've got these small satellites, you can miniaturize instruments on these satellites. That's made quantum leaps. So we're able now to do fabulous things with tiny satellites. And also, the cost of accessing space keeps on falling. So if you have those two converging, well, you've got an opportunity of imagining these constellations that Mustapha was referring to a moment ago, constellations that will bring you into new fields of knowledge. We can imagine constellations for agriculture, for watching the seas, for mastering and harnessing climate phenomenon. All right, you've just talked about cohabitation, haven't you? Living together. Could we imagine working together, between these various players, the new private newcomers and old state players? You're talking about these small or big satellites. Can we imagine a sort of, I don't know, working together among all these various players? Well, yes, quite obviously, and working together strikes me as not only a necessity, but also very interesting, very worthwhile, particularly research. Research in space is very important. Think about Apollo. Think about the space station. Think about these big satellites. This also holds true for constellations. Let's have a hands-on example. Scarbo is a European project. It's piloted by Jean-Luc. It's coming to an end, but there are 8 European partners. What do we do in that program? Well, you measure greenhouse gases, and particularly CO2 and methane. So the project is designed to imagine nanosatellite constellations with miniaturized instruments that meet a high level of performance and need to be devised and developed. That's the point of the project. And this constellation will be used in conjunction with CO2M, which is undergoing development, which will make broader measurements, and the little satellites will do ad hoc measurements. And by structuring that ocean of data, we'll be able to better understand and have better accuracy in understanding CO2 and the methane that flows from man's activities. So this is an example of working together among different-sized players. Now, research and industry, obviously in space, they're very much linked for performance, but also for durability. Now, you work at in space as well, Airbus Defence and Space, Mr. Moury. What can you tell us about that? As Jean-Claude was saying, since its inception, space exploration has involved research and industry because, when you look at space, of course, it's a very aggressive and critical area. Temperature, radiation, sun's rays. So we need to work with a more holistic ecosystem, and we're doing that now, to develop our own in-house systems, to improve, as was said, the satellites that are very big and bulky and meet with a high level of performance, but have NewSpace work with them. It's called NewSpace, really. That's how we describe it, which is a new milestone where all stakeholders are welcome and everybody can make a contribution when thinking about how we want to get from A to B, namely, based on what we know now, how we can develop services for the benefit of mankind. That's a crucial point because space belongs to everybody. What we want to do is to work on developing services for mankind and using all the good ideas that may bubble up to get everybody involved in something which is very complicated. Space is a difficult space to work in. This requires approvals, trials and tests on the Earth's surface before you start using them in long-term fashion in space. It was mentioned a moment ago that NewSpace also involves reducing and miniaturizing artifacts, objects, which also is designed to draw down costs. You talk about nanosatellites, for example. Now, lots of work still needs to be done on nanosatellites, isn't it? I mean, it's a full growth sector, admittedly, but if you say it's in growth, then obviously that requires a regulatory approach. That was mentioned earlier on. But also the materials, the components. What rules need to be built to place certain limits on things and to make sure that NewSpace isn't done at the expense of our space? In other words, we need to make sure that the environment is properly respected and protected. Well, I think this picks on with what Jean-Claude and Mustapha were saying a moment ago. We've got laws that have gone through our parliaments that must be abided by, and they must apply to all the equipment that we sent into space. Obviously, we always think about not we shouldn't afflict on space what we've done with our seas. Space shouldn't be just an area of junk, because you need to recognize, that it's very difficult to get this space junk away from the planet. So we need to frame things with laws, and we need to manage technology that will help us to be reliable in what we do, to make sure at the end of the lifespan, the useful life of that equipment, that it can be pushed out into space, so we can free up area around the Earth. Not talking about launches, but also talking about things that are just drifting in space. Space pollution, if you will, which is really generally small objects. Is that right? That's right. There's a vast array of objects. Now, some have been mapped. You need to remember that all our satellites, most of our low orbit satellites, are followed and tracked, and they're constantly piloted, so they avoid space junk. And the more we have stuff circulating in this margin of in low Earth orbit, we need to clear up that particular fringe so that we avoid finding ourselves in having to, navigate around it too much, but also a collision, of course, which would be a disaster, which would actually generate more debris, which themselves could generate even more debris. It just becomes a snowball. Mr. Traineau, you talked about this new economic paradigm, about next space. At the end of the day, what would be the ideal size? Here you're talking about nanosatellites. Of course, they're not nanoscopic, are they? But what are we talking about size-wise? What's the scale? What's the economic paradigm of this new area of space conquest? I don't know whether you could ever speak of an ideal size. It would really depend on the progress that we've done through these instruments that we're using to measure these magnitudes, either for the atmosphere or on the ground. Of course, there's a compromise that needs to be found, a middle ground. There's no ideal size. I don't think you can put it that way. In all likelihood, satellites will get smaller and smaller on average, and we'll see emerge constellations that are, 100 kilos, possibly less, per satellite. And just to hark back to what Jean-Luc was saying a moment ago, it's absolutely crucial now that all satellites that are going to be thrown up into space, that they have this, that we need to know what's going to become of them, what's their fate when they end their useful life. Now, space traffic management, it's a case in point. It's going to become increasingly important. If you're operating in space, just after the Second World War, we thought about managing our airspace. We have to now manage the space. In France, we have LAWS. It's an act that went through French Parliament. All this needs to be harmonized internationally, and this is one of the major challenges for the future. So to do space traffic management, you need to observe, you need to know where all this stuff is, possibly move them to stop any collision, but also maybe to bring them back to Earth. And you have to think about electrical, innovative propulsion systems, and they're very welcome to do just that. Well, we're going to be talking about these new fuels and propulsion systems with Mr. Richard. You work at ThrustMe. Now, useful life of these machines. So I think that's an important point. Let's dwell on that. What solutions could we have for traffic management, but also not to make matters worse? Could we have something that's degradable? Now, the question of the useful life of these machines, it's a very important question. Thanks for putting it. And Mustapha, Jean-Claude and Jean-Luc have talked about this already, managing these satellites, because we're going to be seeing an exponential growth in the number of satellites in the upcoming years. 10,000 satellites will be going up into space in the next few years. So it's very important to be able to manage these satellites, make sure that we can avoid satellites hitting each other, because that would just generate more and more debris. So there are solutions that are on the table, and electrical propulsion, as Jean-Claude was saying, is a case in point. That propulsion system would offer mobility to the satellites to help them maneuver in space and to avoid any potential for collision, avoid hitting existing debris. And as was said, very rightly, at the end of the useful life of the satellite, that way we'll be able to disintegrate them in space so that they don't clutter up even more the environment of space. And then thinking about the constellations' durability, because a large number of constellations will be inflating even further. And constellations, well, they cost money. So, you want to have a propulsion system that works for a given constellation, makes it possible to reduce the number of useful satellites in said constellations by having them maneuver accurately, but also make sure that the deployment of these constellations are done more efficiently and effectively in such a way that the satellites can generate data more swiftly and generate revenue more quickly as well. And to do that, sitting behind that is the question of the long-lastingness of the fuel in these propulsion systems. Very important, particularly with electric propulsion systems, xenon, which is the traditional fuel that's used. What you realize is not long-lasting. If you want SpaceX, for example, uses krypton instead of xenon. There are also liquid metals, but they're not ideal either. The only fuel which would be ideal is iode, because in terms of iodine, rather, because it costs much less. Xenon is rare, but iodine is abundant on the Earth's surface, so that justifies its price. But also, krypton and xenon are used because of their significant applications on Earth. Anesthesia in hospitals, case in point. Now, something tells me that propulsion based on iodine is being offered, but how did you arrive at iodine? Goodness sake, I mean, it doesn't strike you as something that would immediately spring to mind. Oh, well, why don't we throw things into space with iodine, for goodness sake? So we need to remember that there are researchers from this very school in the Paris-Saclay ecosystem. For more than 15 years, they've analyzed the properties of iodine for its electrical properties. And they realized that iodine proved very good from a budgetary perspective and performance perspective, better than krypton, better than xenon. In terms of the design system, it's much more straightforward, but also in terms of safety and security, because look, xenon and krypton are under pressure to 100 bars. It's like carrying a bomb, whereas iodine is solid. So you don't, it offers lots of advantages. But to come back to your question, the idea of using iodine for electric propulsion systems is nothing new, really. Space community has been dreaming about it for the last 60 years, using iodine as fuel. Lots of papers and literature have dealt with this, to say that it is an ideal fuel. LESA, NASA, for many, many years, have been looking at iodine. But, but we've shown on our side that this dream is possible, and to show that electrical propulsions with iodine can work, and it's been demonstrably so. And these demonstrations have been so innovative that they've actually been featured in Nature, the scientific journal. Well, there are many startups, even here, that come and they promise wondrous things, but these promises don't necessarily come to fruition. We've seen that, haven't we, in R&D? It's an understatement, I would say. So what's the next milestone? And what will be the next space in the new space? And particularly about iodine propulsion systems. Well, the next milestone would be this. We've seen more and more customers who are asking for these propulsion systems more and more. So you want to increase the manufacturing of those systems because, you're talking about the exponential increase of the number of constellations, these mega constellations. In light of that, it's very important for us to have a manufacturing system for these propulsion systems. 350 such systems need to be manufactured per year between now and the end of the year, from this year. So we're going to have another building built to do just that for our company. And what's very important for ThrustMe is to make propulsion systems that are suited to the space industry that is constantly changed. R&D is very important because you don't only do propulsion systems, but also scientific instruments. And as it's been said throughout this panel, we need to work together, working with the various stakeholders, working with research centres, scientific centres, such as we have on the panel, particularly with, and also with companies such as Airbus, to put together a future industry and that's sustainable to manage well what's going on with environment. Now, whatever your names are, for lovers of Jules Verne, and for all those who've looked at the stars, stargazed and dreamt, thanks very much for being with us, for shedding light on this astral border, the final frontier. As you can see, Star Trek and space is something I love. Anyway, thanks very much, all four of you, for being with us. I'll let you go back into the wings. If it was up to me, of course, we'd be speaking about space until the cows come home, as you can imagine. But, you know, we have to move on. And now we're going to be talking about food. There we are, because we know, yeah, a round of applause, because after all, it was fabulous. But now we're going to be moving or leaping in, because of course it's difficult to leap from food to space and back again. But anyway, we are going to be talking about food tech. This is the last round in our Spring 50 before we hand out our prizes at the end of the day. And it's Marion who'll be welcoming the last 5 startups in this pitch contest.